I think Mad Daenerys burning King's Landing was actually really interesting, and for the entirety of the show after season 1, and up until King's Landing's massacre in season 8, I actually felt Daenerys was one of the most boring characters ever. She really was boring to me. I found her interesting in the first season only, and then after that, she became such an obvious fan favorite plot armor turtle that I could just no longer take her seriously. And not only did she become a fan favorite, but because of that stupid super fandom, she also became a favorite of the showmakers. David Benioff and Dan Wise are addicted to audience validation. The more people liked what they were doing, the more they were giving the same thing back to the people, so the gratification circle jerk just keeps going on in perpetuity. And so by the second season, Daenerys was already a Chuck Norris type of character for me. You just know she's always gonna be badass, always winning in the end, and never ever be in any kind of actual danger. And mind you, it wasn't the same with the books for me. In the books, I found her mostly boring, but I never actually disliked her. She was just fine. However, specifically in the show, she was just annoying, and I think part of it might have been Emilia Clarke's acting, which I know many people are gonna hate me for saying that, but I did not like her acting most of the time. She was either kind of underacting or overacting, and never in between. And by the way, I don't want this to be taken as an insult to her. She might be brilliant in other things, I just haven't seen them to be able to compare. I'm just saying she didn't do it for me in Game of Thrones, or at least in the latter seasons, because in season 1, ironically, I thought she was perfect, so maybe it's just about how the character was written. But anyway, for the people who might come after me for saying that, then how about this? I also did not like Peter Dinklage's acting, for pretty much the same reasons as Daenerys, but I'm probably gonna do a separate recording about that. Both of them, perfectly nice people from what I've seen, both of them probably immensely talented in their fields, but in Game of Thrones, neither one worked for me. They just seemed puffed up and overblown. And so, after about 7 seasons of not caring about Daenerys, I finally found her somewhat interesting. Ironically, in the very worst season of Game of Thrones, when she became Hitler. Why is that? Well, it's because she finally became a bit more complex, rather than just Superman on a dragon, just saving everyone all the time, and thinking about freeing slaves or trying to bring down the established aristocracy in the freaking Middle East of Westeros. All of a sudden, she's not so badass anymore, and not such a one-dimensional goodie. She's willing to take innocent lives, and many of them, in order to achieve her political ambition. And when you think about it, realistically, if she was indeed truly willing to rule the known world, how was it possible for her to be any different than a person willing to sacrifice human life? How is it possible for, let's say, a Napoleon to even think about taking over the reins of power without killing anyone? We have this kind of pattern all over history. Alexander, Caesar, Attila, Genghis Khan, Napoleon, Hitler, they all wanted the same thing Daenerys wanted, and they were all mass-murdering psychopaths. It is only logical that if you have this kind of thing as your top priority ambition, then this would mean that everything else would be less valuable to you, including human life. And if you really want ultimate power, you'd sacrifice anything beneath it in order to achieve it. And if you pretend otherwise, you're a liar, which Daenerys ultimately was. All her talk about not wanting to be Queen of the Ashes, not true. She didn't care about human suffering. She ultimately only cared about power. And that's not to say that she was necessarily lying, maybe she just hadn't realized it in the first few seasons. Maybe she's trying to convince herself of her goodness, instead of trying to fool others. And I love that. As I said, it makes her complex. Now, mind you, it also makes her a psychopathic piece of garbage, but that's not the point. The point is that this kind of complexity makes her interesting in the story, at least to me. And so she burns down King's Landing at the end, and then she gets killed. I have to stress, the way it was portrayed, overly rushed, melodramatic, and logistically retarded, I hated all of that. Especially the very last episode of the entire show, when she's killed. That was about the biggest pile of garbage I'd ever watched in my life. But the idea of the plot twist in itself, I think it's brilliant. And I think George R.R. Martin has the same plan for her in the books. It's totally in his style and understanding, taking the trope of the typical fantasy/superhero character and then turning it on its head so as to shake people off of their ingrained perceptions of the world. You have to understand, and I'm speaking to all those masses of idiots who were cheering for Daenerys for like 7 seasons, naming their babies after her, and all of that insane crap. You are all idiots, and George R. R. Martin thinks you're idiots as well, because the idea of Daenerys, the character, it's not for us to love her and root for her like mindless sheep. We're not supposed to cheer for anyone. George R. R. Martin, as a writer and a historian, bases his characters on the idea that they're all human and grey and imperfect. And because of that, it would be dangerous to root for any one of them. Much like in Nietzsche's philosophy, Martin's trying to tell us that it's dangerous for us to have idols in the first place. You shouldn't be putting anyone on a pedestal, because people are just that, people. And a golden fish can turn into a piranha at any given point in time, whether in art and literature, or in real life. We shouldn't be idolizing anyone. We should only observe and learn from people's successes, people's mistakes, people's regrets, their tragedy and failure, their struggles and their strengths. And I think that's both beautiful and tragic for us as a species. Martin is obviously fascinated by this idea and trying to make it his main point in these books.